Thank you, Monique. Thanks, everybody, for coming. So we're going to be talking about a study that we did, which is based on a pilot intervention that we sort of organized and evaluated. We were, in a sense, brokers among a number of organizations to put this intervention together. And it involves addressing essential skills gaps in a particular occupational health and safety training program. So there's the three of us that will be speaking, but there are others who are part of the main research team, two of whom are in the room, Curtis and Michael. Karen Myers, also a big part of the research team on this, but there's a bigger team that I'm going to come to in a moment. And we had funding from, grant funding from two sources for this, the Max Bell Foundation, which has an interest in learning issues, among other things, and the Research Opportunities Program of the Ministry of Labor. And because we had funding from two sources, we were able to build in, after we had started the project, we were able to add on a qualitative component to the project, which actually proved to be really critical, I think, in terms of what we were able to learn, as I hope you'll get a feel of over the course of the next half hour. So the main project team, the core team, we've talked about this group and Karen Myers and her colleague Mark McCrow at Blueprint Consulting, but there's also an extended team that involved the training center where the intervention occurred. So this is the Training Center of Local 506 of the Laborers Union, that training center in Richmond Hill. And so the director of the training center, the assistant director, and actually the lead instructor for the program, who's not listed here, Craig Gedney, happens to be Ted's son, was actually very much involved in the development of the intervention and in the sort of assessment of what we learned from it. IHSA was a big part of the project. Their curriculum was the basis for the intervention. We were modifying a curriculum that they had developed, and their curriculum team was involved in the modifications of the curriculum that were led by a consultant, Tracy Collins, but IHSA, the training center, and others, Skill Plan in BC in particular, were very much involved in the curriculum development. Essential Skills Group was the provider of the essential skills assessment that we'll be talking about a little bit in the next little while. So what are essential skills? Basically, essential skills are foundational skills. They are the foundation for learning other skills. There's a framework of essential skills that has been developed internationally. Canada has participated in the development of that framework. And through Employment and Social Development Canada, there's actually quite a lot of information about the essential skills framework on the ESDC part of the Government of Canada website. And one of the things ESDC has done is to map essential skills onto occupations, so that for every, or for a wide range of occupations, there is a listing of key tasks associated with that occupation, and for each task, the level of essential skills, of the 9 essential skills that's required to do that job well. Almost every occupation has at least some tasks that require at least level 3 on a 5-level scale, and that will become important, as you'll see. So these are the 9 essential skills. Reading text, document use, these two together are sometimes referred to as literacy skills. Numeracy, these are the ones we ended up focusing on, but there are 6 others. Writing, oral communication, working with others, continuous learning, thinking skills, problem solving, digital technology, computer skills. So those are the 9 essential skills that have been developed in this framework. So why did we do this? The motivation for this, two key things. One is that we know that a large part of the adult workforce in Canada has essential skills challenges, essential skills gaps. Canada has participated in multiple rounds of assessments of adult competencies internationally. The last one was in 2012, and that last one showed that almost half of the working age population in Canada was below level 3 in literacy skills, and over half was below level 3 in numeracy skills. Another motivation for the project, key one really, was that we knew both from the literature and from a conference that Karen Myers and I went to, hosted by the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters a number of years ago, where this issue specifically was discussed, that workers being reluctant to sign up for dedicated workplace literacy programs or essential skills programs, because to sign up is in a way to identify yourself as having a gap. And so you can imagine that people might be reluctant to self-identify. And people at that conference were talking about, this becomes a challenge in occupational health and safety training, because we have people taking the training sometimes who have weak essential skills, but they don't want to take workplace essential skills programs. It would be nice if there would be a way to kind of try to address that within the occupational health and safety training programs themselves. And Karen Myers and I were sitting at a table at this conference and chatting with each other and saying, it would be cool if we could actually try an experiment to see if, or an intervention study to see if we could do something like that. And that's kind of what led to the intervention. So the research question, can we improve the effectiveness of an occupational health and safety training program by redesigning the curriculum of an existing program to address essential skills gaps? An important aspect of this is we were not expecting to measure improvements in essential skill levels. What we were expecting to measure is improvements in the learning of the occupational health and safety curriculum, right? To have measurable effects on essential skills program would take a much longer duration intervention that would be feasible for what we had in mind here. So how did we identify the target program? There was actually a small feasibility study that was funded through the old WSIB Research Advisory Council program, the old RAC program. Through that program, as a result of that funding, we consulted with health and safety associations and some other training organizations in Ontario about this idea, and whether we could identify a program where there was substantial injury risk and that most of the trainees would be expected to have essential skills gaps. And so through that process, we ended up selecting the hoisting and rigging program that's delivered by Local 506 of the laborers in Richmond Hill. Important thing to know is it's called the hoisting and rigging program, but it's really about the rigging, okay? Because the crane operation is you have to go through an apprenticeship program for that. It's a much higher level of training, much higher level of training expectation to be able to operate a crane. We're not talking about the people who operate a crane. We're talking about the people who rig the loads that crane operators lift, okay? And for that, there are competencies, but there's not a formal program that you're required to go through. But there is this program that's voluntary, but its certificate is often cited by employers as evidence of competency that people take in order to be trained on how to do the rigging of the loads safely. Okay, so that's who we're talking about here, is the riggers. And so what we did is we took the curriculum that was in place, and we developed a modified version of that curriculum using essential skills experts in consultation with the training center and with IHSA about what were the key essential skills involved in this occupation. We settled on document use and numeracy as the most important ones. There are others, but we had to be focused to keep the duration of the intervention manageable. So we focused on numeracy and document use. We developed a new version of the training program that, for document use, for example, instead of just providing information, these are what the regulations say that are pertinent to this occupation, the regulations under the OHSA. Instead of just saying these are what the regulations say, there was a whole new section developed that was about how to use the pertinent parts of the OHSA and the regulations as a reference document that trainees would be able to go back to as they needed to identify the relevant pieces that were important for their occupation. So there was a new module that did that. And on the numeracy side, there was the development of a whole series of examples to build up their capacity from basic arithmetic to the ability to do the calculations that need to be done ultimately to determine whether a load is rigged safely or will be rigged safely. So some trainees took the regular program, others took the modified program. They're assigned by groups, right? So it was a whole group of, and there were only 4 or 5, these are small groups. There were only 4 or 5 people at a time taking the program. It's a very small pilot, very small numbers. So some groups took the regular program, some took the modified program. There were some review exercises added to the regular program, the baseline program, to keep the duration the same so that people wouldn't say, well, it's because you spent longer time teaching them. And we tested the trainees' essential skill levels before the training. We tested their knowledge of safety after the training. There was also some demographic information and some exit questionnaires about their attitudes about training and their competencies after the training as well. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Siobhan, who's going to take us through the analysis that we did through the results of the quantitative part of the study.
Thank you, Ron. Our participant involvement began with, so Ron provided you with an overview of how we prepared to begin this intervention. When our participants became involved, we conducted 2 types of intakes. One with the baseline group, so the trainees doing the original training program, and one with the modified intakes, so that included the modified curriculum with the numeracy and document use curriculum embedded in the existing occupational health and safety program. We then collected both quantitative and qualitative data for both groups, which we'll run through in a few slides. And then we analyzed that data, and based on our findings, we synthesized key considerations. We then consulted with HSAs and our project partners to see if they validated the findings that we had from the trainees and from our interviews that we conducted. And we created a process guide on recommendations for embedding essential skills into other occupational health and safety training programs. Our intention was to include an additional assessment, so a worksite assessment, where we could observe trainees actually applying the knowledge they learned in the program on a worksite. However, due to a few reasons, it was difficult to do that. One of them being we had some trouble recruiting contractors, and one of those reasons were because of the health and safety training we would have to take in order to observe them in such close proximity, watching them do the rigging. Lastly, one of the barriers we faced was that many of the trainees enrolled in the programs were not actually working as riggers on the job site. They were working as general laborers, or they were taking this training in between jobs. Often trainees at the Union Training Center were taking these trainings in between employment in order to increase their job prospects and chances of being called onto a job. So when we collected data on trainee essential skill level and their hoisting and rigging knowledge. And we did that in 4 ways. We first asked all of our trainees in both the baseline and modified groups to complete a demographic survey where we asked them about age, languages spoken, educational attainment, and their experience in both construction and hoisting and rigging more specifically. Trainees then completed an essential skills assessment, and that was focused on document use and numeracy. The essential skills assessment was designed to be 45 minutes to an hour, and in actuality was taking the trainees an hour and a half to 2 hours to complete. Thirdly, all trainees completed a hoisting and rigging written test. Now, this is the test that they use for the hoisting and rigging program in order to pass or fail them. and that focuses on foundational job tasks and hand signals. Lastly, we asked them to complete an exit survey, and this was for us to better understand their attitudes and learning preferences, as well as provide them with an opportunity to give their feedback on the training program. And we used that question in order to see if there were any differences between the baseline instruction and the modified instruction. And so the meat of the presentation now is the findings. Who were these trainees? Approximately 70%, and before I go on, there were no key differences in the demographics across both groups. So these, what I'll share with you now, apply to both the baseline and the modified intakes. So approximately 70% of trainees were born in Canada. A third of them had not completed high school, and another 40% did not have a post-secondary credential. Based on the completed essential skill tests, 85% had document use skills below a level 3. We also did have a numeracy assessment. However, we had quite a bit of missing data there, and many of the trainees were unable to complete that. So based on what we did have, the essential skills assessment for numeracy, many of the participants scored considerably lower, sitting at a high level 1, low level 2. When it came to the analysis, the score on the written test at the end of the training was used as the dependent variable, and the key explanatory variable was whether or not the trainee was in the baseline or the modified group. We controlled alternately for age, first language, educational attainment, years of experience in construction and in hoisting and rigging. The results were that the modified program had a significantly positive effect on the test score. And despite the fact that we had a small sample size, the effect size was substantial. So I'm just going to turn the floor over to Morgane, and she'll provide us a bit more detail on the qualitative data collection and the findings.
We collected our qualitative data through interviews and focus groups, and as Ron mentioned, because we got the funding for the qualitative component partway through the study, we had already completed the baseline assessment, so we had to go back and contact those participants by phone. So we were only able to get 5 of them on the phone there. And then the modified groups were happening when we got the funding, so we were able to recruit them right after they completed their intake. So we had 4 focus groups with those graduates, and in total there were 20 participants there, so 25 in total. And in addition to this, we also interviewed our project partners, so members at the training center, the instructor who delivered the training, curriculum developers, and some learning specialists to better understand their perspectives on training and other contextual factors. So our analysis was inductive process, and we also further analyzed between themes for connections between themes. And this process involved weekly meetings with Ron, the PI, Siobhan, and myself. And we also consulted back with our team members to validate our findings and make sense of anything that was unclear to us. And we also shared our preliminary findings with health and safety associations in Ontario to, again, further validate what we were hearing and to see if it resonated with their experiences. The findings that emerged in the qualitative section of the study were really not specific to the hoisting and rigging training program. They were actually relevant to the construction industry as a whole, which was interesting. So we organized our findings in 4 main categories. So there were industry factors, workplace factors, worker factors, and last, training factors. And I'm going to take you through each of those in turn. So the first main industry-related factor that emerged from our findings was a perceived tension between production and safety culture in the construction industry. So our participants reported that they really perceived that there was a sort of tug of war between the two, and this is a very well documented theme. This perceived tension between production and safety culture is a very well documented theme. It's nothing new. However, it really sets the stage for everything else that we found in the data, including training. So our participants reported there's an overarching focus on production in the construction industry, and particularly so in Toronto, in the GTA, because of the large volume of construction activity that's there. And this focus on production, participants reported that it can affect work practices by creating pressures to get work done quickly. And they also reported that this can get in the way of following the safety practices that they are taught in training. So there were also participants, however, that reported that in recent years there has been an increase in safety practices as they perceive. And so they feel that it may be moving towards more the safety culture side. However, there were still many participants who reported that tension. So here's a quote from one of our participants, and he's talking about newer people that are coming out of training into the work site. And he was saying, there's guys who've been on the job for 2 weeks and safety is all they care about because that's the number one thing in their head. Safety, 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 which is good, but at the same time, they don't really get much work done. So now I'm gonna, so the second main theme in the relating to broader industry factors was the tension between high-risk work versus lower labor market power. So we know that from our data that while rigging tasks are often routine, involving familiar combinations of the size of the load, the configuration of it, and the type of crane that's being used, the consequences of improperly rigging a load can be fatal. And we actually had 3 participants who had witnessed a fatality at the workplace, although they were not all related to hoisting and rigging, but so there's a high amount of risk there. And related to this, our population of trainees do not usually require a journey person certificate for the work that they're doing. So they usually end up having lower job security because there's less requirements for the job they're doing. And this in turn can influence their likelihood of refusing unsafe work. So there's high-risk work, but lower labor market power, so they're not always empowered to refuse unsafe situations. And here I have a quote that illustrates the notion of lower job security maybe impacting your ability to refuse unsafe work. So participant was saying about a coworker, if he's saying, I'm not going up on that roof, it's slippery, it's icy, my life is at risk, the next guy shouldn't turn around and say, well, screw you, I'm going to do it. This was their language. The next broad theme was workplace factors. So workplace factors that influence training and how our population does their work. So the major theme there was how participants describe their work sites. So they describe busy work sites, very complex environments where a lot of things are happening at once, time pressures, and then they also talked about a notion of the good worker. So they described the work site as a fast-paced environment and multiple trades often competing for space and time simultaneously. And related to this, they reported the pressure to look busy. So our participants talked about the importance of always appearing to be doing something, being in motion, for fear of being reprimanded by their supervisors if they were to appear idle or unproductive. This again relates to both the busyness of the worksite in general, but also our particular trainee group's lower level of job security. And participants also discussed this concept of the good worker as being someone who gets the work done. So the good worker for our trainees was someone who's efficient, hardworking, who doesn't complain, which may involve not refusing unsafe work and not complaining about tasks. And also, they really saw themselves and their job as just being physically able and not necessarily doing the more intellectual aspects of the job and delegating those to other people on the work site. So here's a quote that perfectly illustrates that. The participant was saying, the engineers are the brain and we are the brawn. Another main theme related to what happens at the workplace is the use of shortcuts. So I mentioned the busy work sites and the time pressures, and this can interfere workers' ability to apply what they learn in training. So the way that it affects their work habits is that participants reported that they often use shortcuts or alternatives to formal calculations to gauge the safety of loads. So these shortcuts there were several examples. So one of them was performing mini lifts. So instead of going ahead, having calculated the load size and going ahead with the lift, they would actually just kind of configure the load the way that they thought would be safe and then lift it a few inches off the ground, see whether it balanced, and if it did, then they would go ahead. So they would circumvent doing the calculation and just test it out. Another shortcut was just using oversized equipment. So you have a small load, you just use the biggest crane to be safe. And the last one was estimation. So because the hoisting and rigging often involves familiar loads where they've seen that same size, the same shape, and they've been using that same crane, so they know they've done it before, they can do it again, or it's similar enough that they can, get away with it. And when we spoke to the training center, they told us that estimation is a very common practice and that it's usually not problematic. It's actually usually okay. However, they did say that in the instances where the load is not familiar or generic, if you're not able to do the formal calculation and follow the safety procedures, the consequences can then be fatal. So the quote that's on this slide is from a participant describing what he would do on the worksite versus what he was taught in the training. And he's saying, if it would have taken me that long on an actual job site to move a load from here to there, I would have been fired, I would have lost my job. So moving on to themes that related to who our population was. So our trainees discussed the diversity, both racially and ethnically on work sites, which is linked to also diversity of languages spoken. And they discussed that sometimes, having a lot of diverse languages on site can lead to communication barriers. They acknowledged that communication is a key aspect of construction work and that hence language barriers can create safety issues. But some of them also discussed that for hoisting and rigging specifically, they communicate with the crane operator using universal hand signals. So some of them felt that that was enough to get them to do the job safely, even if they didn't speak the same language. But as you can see in the quote, there were situations where language barriers led to participants feeling unsafe. So this participant is saying, because I couldn't necessarily understand what my supervisor was saying, I just kind of assumed, and there were situations where I was put in unsafe situations because of the lack of understanding that we had with each other. So clearly there were situations where hand signals would not cut it for this participant. Another worker factor is something that is closely related to our quantitative data. So as Siobhan told you, the quantitative findings really outline our participants' low essential skill levels in document use and numeracy. And we kind of confirmed this observationally during the qualitative data collection. So during focus groups, we could see that many were hesitant to speak. Not all of them had good language skills, and also the fact that they took so long to complete the essential skills assessment in the beginning. And we also saw some participants struggle with using iPads that we were providing for the training. So we saw some little observations that would indicate lower essential skill levels. They did not, however, discuss those with us in the focus groups or the interviews, but they did talk about numeracy. And they really discussed, it came up a lot that the formal calculations part of the training was difficult for them. So the second quote there is from a participant who was in the modified program. So his program had actually included embedded essential skills extra material, so it should have been easier, but he is saying the math questions there could have been a few more examples to help us through and broken down a little easier to understand. So they're needing maybe perhaps even more modification than what we had done. And the first quote there is a participant saying, you had these basic hand signals and then this advanced calculus math. That was a little tricky. And the interesting thing about that quote is that the training had no calculus in it whatsoever. It was just regular calculations. And our last main theme was training factors. So the biggest theme there was the sense of a disconnect between training and worksite practice. So we've talked about how the realities of the worksite can be in conflict with what the workers are trained to do. And this really came through in the data, especially when they were discussing using calculations on the worksite. So participants discussed the pressure to look busy and to reflect the image of the good worker, and that may not be conducive to stepping back and taking the time to do a formal calculation on the actual work site. So here's a quote where a participant is saying, well, you don't really have the opportunity to sit there and crunch numbers if things are going on. And this is also related to their lower job security again, where they maybe don't feel empowered to say, I need to step back and take a moment to do the calculation. They are afraid that they might be perceived as idle, so they kind of just do what they need to do to be seen as a good worker. And the last main theme related to training is, again, probably nothing new and applies to more industries than just the construction industry, but it was the importance of hands-on learning for the participants. So even though they really struggled with the formal calculations and those aspects of the training, they did report that the more hands-on equipment-based portion of training were easier for them to understand and to apply on work sites. This was particularly the case for the hand signals and then different knot tying techniques that they were taught. And the quote here is a participant saying, what applies to us, the actual practical things, slings and cables and all that, that's more beneficial. And this is interesting because it seems that he's highlighting that only those aspects of the training apply to him, whereas really the training is a hoisting and rigging training program, everything should apply. So here it may indicate that there's a difficulty understanding the more theoretical aspects of training, and for them to both understand how that applies to their work, but also how to apply it. And now I'm going to hand it over to Ron.
Okay, so in light of all this, we've identified some considerations for the training center in this program, but some of them more broadly potentially in the construction center. For this particular program, we think it's important that the training center identify why and when the formal calculations are important. That we know people are using shortcuts, but we also know that there are circumstances where the use of shortcuts is really dangerous. And what we're suggesting the training center consider is building into the program the importance of the ability to do the formal calculations and to help the trainees identify when it's really essential that they do the formal calculations. So that's one key consideration based on what we heard. More applied exercises using the equipment found on the work sites. Some of the training sessions were done at the Richmond Hill Training Center where they actually have equipment that, like they have the cranes that correspond to what people would use on work sites, but some of the sessions were done at a union hall where they were using models. And what we heard is people saying we really want to be working with the equipment that we are going to be using on the work site. So wherever possible, focusing on applied exercises using the equipment found on work sites. Streamlining the training content to focus on what can be applied. We know from IHSA and from the training center that employers, not surprisingly, have a legitimate interest in the training being lean, in the sense that it's it's focused on what really is necessary in order to do the job safely, that they have an interest in the duration not being longer than it needs to be. And the trainee, we heard that from trainees too, because some of the trainees are taking time off work in order to participate in this training. So they were also saying that, you know, they want this focused on what they can apply. So, you know, so that's something we hear from both, you know, from the contractors and the trainees is the importance of focusing on what can be applied on the job. And that may mean that in terms of some of the details of the regulations, that what's most important is the ability of the trainees to use the regulations as a reference document, as the modified program would teach them to do. Incorporating a worksite-based mentorship component, well, the idea here really is the importance of having reinforcement at the worksite for the trainees to apply what they've learned, that there's reinforcement at the worksite that encourages the graduates of the program to apply what they have learned. So that can be through mentors. In the mining sector, that's used. In construction, that may not be feasible because of the mobility of work. But to translate it into the construction sector, empowering the supervisor, empowering the contractors, empowering the supervisors to reinforce the importance for the riggers of taking the time to do the formal calculations when they're important, right? That needs there's a workplace culture component to that you can't just achieve through the training program itself. So those are I mean, these are things we heard from a very small pilot. So, you know, there's that caution, this small number of people involved. But there were some pretty consistent themes here that you've heard across the trainees that participated in the interviews and the focus groups. We still think this is promising for a number of reasons. This kind of intervention is promising. One reason it's promising is we have the analysis that says that that the learning, the performance on the written test of their knowledge at the end of the training program was significantly higher for people who took the modified program compared to the regular program. And to achieve that with the small numbers we had meant the effect size was substantial. People who went through the modified program had substantially higher scores than people who went through the regular program. So there is that, which is important. We also know that the main instructor for the course has said, I am continuing to use the modified program. I find it really helpful in terms of getting across, the use of the regulations and this building up of their capacity to do the calculations, that the instructor found that really helpful. And so the instructor is continuing to use the modified program. And the training center, in light of all that, has actually said to us, we are interested in trying this out with another program. They've mentioned forklift as a possible example, but we'll have some dialogue with them about future possibilities. So the intervention is promising, but there are challenges around applying what people have learned on the job. What are we doing next? We've almost completed. We have almost completed a guide for people who want to try to do something like this with another program. A high level, I mean, we're not curriculum experts, but what we've developed in consultation with the curriculum lead on this project and with IHSA and with other HSAs and with the training center is a high level guide that sort of takes people through all the steps involved in this kind of intervention, including the evaluation components. So that guide will be completed quite soon and available to others who may want to try this sort of intervention. And Siobhan has got it on the current version of it. We may be fine-tuning it a bit on a tablet, and it's kind of interactive a bit, so that if you get to the the process at a glance, and you can click on step 4 and it'll tell you the details for step 4, that kind of thing. So, Yeah, so the guide sort of is going to look something like this. Christina's been great in terms of the graphics for the guide. So there's these 12 steps that it sort of takes people through, from identifying a suitable program to the evaluation at the end, but developing your evaluation strategy much earlier on. And that's basically it.
Thank you so very much for such an interesting and engaging speaker. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.